So, Mr. Volker, thank you so much for your time and for this interview. So, I'd like to discuss with you the future of NATO following this really important summit. So, we have about 15 minutes to cover the main topics like security, enlargement, and the threats which was mentioned in the declaration.
Right.
So, let's start with the big win of the summit. So, key summit outcome, which was defense spending raise to 5%, said to be much more than Russia's and China's spending, right? So, but what does it really says about how NATO sees its future and the threats it's getting ready for?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for having me, and I wish Independence Avenue Media all of the best in your new venture here. I think this was a very successful NATO summit. And the number one issue is what you mentioned. It is countries agreeing to spend 5% of GDP on defense. And to unpack what that means, well, first off, it is a better balanced alliance than it had been. And that imbalance had led to a lot of political frustration in the United States, particularly with President Trump and his voting base, who saw this as very unfair. But it wasn't only them. If you think back to the Obama administration, people complained about European defense spending. Same thing in the Bush administration. So the first thing is that this achieves a better and more fair balance of responsibilities within the alliance, which is going to keep the U.S. committed to NATO. And President Trump pretty much said that at the summit. In addition to that, it's a recognition by our European allies that they actually face much bigger threats on the European continent now, and they need to actually invest in defense capability and defense industry if they want to be protected against those threats. So it's a recognition that that is out there. And to be very clear about this, this would not have happened if Vladimir Putin had not launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 22. This was a wake-up call for Europe, and they did wake up. And so Putin, contrary to defeating Ukraine and dividing Europe, has ended up with a stronger Ukraine, a sovereign and independent Ukraine, and a stronger Europe that has decided to spend more on defense as a result of Putin's actions.
So do you think this increase could spark new arms race with Russia or China?
Well, no. This increase is a response to what Russia and China are already doing. And so Russia has launched this massive invasion. They have poured money into their defense industry, into their military. They're building up all these capabilities. So rather than viewing this as provoking an arms race, I would look at this as a necessary response to what Russia has already done. And it may end up deterring Russia when a weak position for Europe and NATO would not.
So you already mentioned the role of the U.S. in this process, right, in this summit. So the NATO leader said that the President Trump's vision lead the summit. So how do you see the future of the relations, the ties of the U.S. and NATO, moving forward?
Well, as I said, I think it's better balanced, and that makes it more politically sustainable. So that is very important. We don't have this finger pointing and recrimination that we had before this. In addition to that, it's going to allow the U.S. to focus on global threats as much as we do, and Europe will take a larger responsibility within Europe for European security. And it also was clear that Europe was trying to make the summit a success for President Trump. If you think back to 2018, President Trump came in and blew up that summit over the issue of defense spending, very upset with NATO, threatened that we wouldn't support Article 5 or defend countries if they were attacked if they hadn't paid their share. That is completely different now. And President Trump, as he was leaving, said that he came away with a very different opinion of NATO, that these people love their countries, that the U.S. will help defend those countries. So that is a market change, and I think that bodes well for the future of NATO and the future of U.S. and European mutual commitment to NATO.
So, what about the enlargement? So, declaration did not mention it. So, do you think it is the big win for Russia, or NATO is giving up on enlargement?
Yeah. So, I know that Russia would like to portray this as a big win, but the reality is it's not. What you have here is, for the past 2 NATO summits before this one, you had language that was very supportive of Ukraine's, the future is in NATO, but with no real commitment to moving ahead. That has not changed. Same idea, same language from the past, that has not been changed. It takes a consensus at NATO to undo something or to change something. There's no consensus to do that. So rather than focusing on something that is not immediate and where there might even have been differences of nuance among allies, if we were to make that a point of emphasis, we just put it aside. We said it's not happening right now anyway. Let's not focus on that and not air any public differences, but rather show unity among NATO allies. Now, with respect to Georgia, there, I think it was to Georgia's advantage not to be mentioned as well, because if it had, I'm quite sure there would have been a differentiation between Georgia and anyone else who aspires to NATO membership, because the Georgian government's actions over the past few years have really pulled Georgia away from NATO.
So was it to, like, the not upsetting Russia to don't mention this enlargement in the declaration? What was the reason?
Wouldn't say it upset them. I think they are trying to make something out of this as an advantage for Russia, but it's really not there. And let's flip this around. Let's put yourself into Vladimir Putin's shoes. Here you are, you're struggling in your invasion of Ukraine. You're not giving up, but you've lost 1 million people, and you are having to, reach into your stockpiles to get World War II era tanks and fighting vehicles and North Korean artillery and Iranian drones. So this is not going all that well. Meanwhile, NATO gets together, shows tremendous unity, increases its defense spending. President Trump says warm words about NATO rather than criticizing NATO. President Zelensky is there, has a bilateral meeting with Trump. Trump says he'll sell him Patriot missiles. And this is all on the back of, a few days earlier, these B-2 bombers flying into Iran and out and hitting their target multiple times without the S-400 and S-300 systems that Iran has being able to react at all. That has got to be a big wake-up call for Vladimir Putin.
Why the enlargement is important for NATO's security? So isn't NATO safer when it expands to countries like Ukraine, Georgia?
Yeah. Well, this is it. And you put your finger on it. It's a balancing act. If Ukraine were to become a member of NATO today, NATO would take on an obligation to fight Russia, to defend Ukrainian territory. So NATO countries don't want to fight Russia right now. They don't want to expand this war to an all-NATO Russia war. However, if there's a ceasefire, if the war is stopped, then it's in everybody's interest to make sure it doesn't start again. And the best way to do that is to bring Ukraine into NATO so that Putin knows if he starts this war again, he's now going to face all of NATO, and it's going to be much worse for Russia. So that's how you try to then reinforce peace, by bringing Ukraine in. And moreover, I think Europeans know, probably better than the American administration right now, Europeans know that if Putin is allowed to win in Russia, he will not stop there. And President Trump said this in The Hague at the NATO summit. He said he knows Putin would not stop there. But he has laid claims to territory of the former Russian Empire, which includes the Baltic states, which includes Finland, which includes part of Poland, which includes part of Kazakhstan, which includes the country of Georgia. So he has laid far more expansive claims of Russian territory than he has achieved to date. So if Ukraine is defeated and incorporated into a Russian empire, we're going to face a wider war. Whereas if Ukraine is sovereign, independent, and secure, that is the principal and most important bulwark against further Russian expansion.
So last question about enlargement. So there are like the Georgian policymakers, they are saying that that NATO's open doors policy in fact is like closed doors. So what do you think about this?
No, and I think people who think that are missing the point. What President Trump has emphasized is fairness. He wants European allies to pay their fair share and bear their fair share of the burden of security. He felt the United States was doing too much. That is different than saying he doesn't believe in enlarging NATO. If a country can contribute to NATO and to European security and help prevent war, there's no reason why he would be against that. So I think they're misinterpreting what they're hearing from President Trump. And Europe's steps, NATO European allies' steps to increase defense spending is a great start. It doesn't guarantee further enlargement, but it certainly makes it more imaginable than it was before.
Yeah. So with Russia mentioned like major threat for NATO. So what do you think? How the US and NATO can balance like diplomacy and pressure on Russia?
Yeah. Well, this I would argue that we are not doing a good job at that right now. We are giving too much emphasis to dialogue and talk and urging Putin to negotiate, and not enough emphasis to setting the terms, setting the conditions on the ground that will force Putin to negotiate. Right now, Putin feels very comfortable. He is not feeling any pressure from the West. So that means he's not going to negotiate in any good faith. And we see that in his actions every day. Just 2 nights ago, he launched the largest single air raid against Ukraine from this entire 3-year, 4-month conflict. So he is clearly not interested or feeling any need to talk. So we need to increase the pressure on Russia through tightening sanctions, particularly secondary sanctions, and also through demonstrating that there will be a continued supply of arms and ammunition for Ukraine for as far as the eye can see. And if we can do that, then we're sending Putin a message that it's only going to get worse for him, so he had better stop the war now.
Do you have expectations that we will see the new sanctions against Russia from this administration?
I do. We're not there yet. President Trump clearly doesn't want to do that. He wants to get to a point where there's an agreement with Putin and we can move forward. So it's not his goal to have these sanctions. We heard that from Secretary of State Rubio in The Hague. He expressed that, well, we're not there yet. We still want to focus on negotiations. But I think a lot of people know that that's not going to work. The only pressure, continued pressure on Russia will actually lead them toward negotiations. So I expect that before the end of this month, the end of July, you'll have the Senate and the House pass the secondary sanctions legislation, which will strengthen Trump's hand in negotiations. He would have the legal authority, the ability to impose those secondary sanctions and put greater squeeze on Russia's economy. And I think that he, as I said, doesn't want to do it, but if he's getting pressure from Republicans in Congress, and if Putin continues to ignore the calls for a ceasefire, he may feel that he has to do it in order to get to that ceasefire that he wants.
Yeah, when it comes to threats, declaration did not mention China alongside Russia, right? So why China was left out from this process?
Well, I think President Trump wants to keep the focus on Europe doing its part for European security. This is what this 5% was about. The feeling that the United States was bearing too much of the load of security for Europe when Europe was not doing it itself. So he wanted to focus on the threat to Europe, it's coming from Russia, and it's Europe's responsibility to spend more to deal with that, and the U.S. can help. Coming to China, I think President Trump is looking at that through a very different lens, where he recognizes that is the single biggest threat to the world, and the United States directly, the only peer competitor that we're going to face. But he wants to try to manage that somewhat differently. He wants to see if he can maintain a relationship with China while building up American capacities to deal with China. And just putting out language that sounds menacing or sounds like we recognize China as a threat without putting anything behind it, it's not really what he wants to do. So I think he felt better putting the focus on Europe and dealing with China separately.
Good. Thank you so much for your time again.
Thank you so much. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks.